propane. That's the thing I keep coming back to. Somebody sat down in the mid-90s and decided the moral center of an animated sitcom should be a man who sells propane and propane accessories. And it worked so well that the actual propane industry ended up regarding him as good publicity. Texas Monthly put him on their Texas 20 list in 1997 alongside Real People, and he was the first non-human ever to make it. So that's Hank Hill. And Arlen, Texas, is one of the most thoroughly mapped fictional towns in American television, which means people have spent the best part of 30 years filling in every gap the show left open. That's what we're doing tonight, all of them, or near enough. The paternity stuff, the cotton stuff, the Dale stuff, the ones about why nobody ages, and the surprisingly large pile of theories that turned out to be true. I'll tell you which is which as we go. No guessing games. If you fancy sticking around for more of these, subscribing is free and it does help. Right. Let's start with Bobby. There's a scene fairly late in the run where Bill passes the Dauterive family recipe onto Bobby. It's played as a warm little thing, the sort the show does constantly without drawing attention to it. And for most people watching it, lands exactly the way it's meant to. Bill's lonely. Bobby's one of the few people in Arlen who genuinely likes his company, and the recipe is the one thing Bill has left that's worth handing to somebody. For a certain corner of the fandom, though, that scene is evidence, because the single most popular King of the Hill theory going, the one that turns up in every comment section and every list video, is that Bill Dauterive is Bobby's biological father. I want to lay it out properly before I take it apart because it's built better than most fan theories are. The version people usually tell goes like this. Hank and Peggy struggled to conceive. Peggy, desperate, slept with Bill. Bobby is the result, and the whole neighborhood quietly knows. The same way the whole neighborhood quietly knows that Joseph Gribble is John Redcorn's son, and they've all silently agreed not to say anything about it. The theory supporters point out that this would make the show's biggest running joke into something much sharper. You spend 13 seasons laughing at Dale for not noticing the obvious, and the entire time the show is running the identical trick on you with the main character. That's a genuinely clever idea. If it were true, it would be one of the great long cons in television. It's also, as far as I can tell, completely wrong, and the show goes out of its way to shut the door on it. But first, the bit of canon the theory hangs off, because this is where it gets properly interesting. In Season 3, there's an episode called Pregnant Pause, and it does something the show almost never does. It goes back 14 years and shows you Hank and Peggy trying to have a baby and failing. They see a fertility doctor, and the doctor tells Hank that the problem is a narrow urethra brought on by years of chronic tension, and advises him not to stress about it any further, which is, when you think about it, the single least useful piece of medical advice anyone has ever given Hank Hill. The man's whole condition is that he can't stop being tense. Telling him to relax about his inability to relax is a closed loop. Now, one thing worth flagging here. Urethral width has essentially nothing to do with male fertility in real life. It is a recognized cause of male infertility. The show made it up because it's funnier than the real explanation, and because it let them build an entire episode around Hank being physically incapable of loosening up. Later on, an episode called Next of Shin quietly patches the science by giving Hank a low sperm count instead, which actually is a real factor. I like that they bothered. It's a very King of the Hill thing to do, going back 4 seasons later to tidy up a joke nobody was going to check. So the theory has a foothold. Hank has a documented fertility problem. Peggy wanted a child badly. Bobby doesn't look much like Hank. Bill has been obviously embarrassingly in love with Peggy since roughly the pilot, and Peggy's dislike of him always seems a bit stronger than the situation warrants. Line those up and you can see how somebody got there. And the reason it doesn't hold is sitting in the same episode. That same episode, the one the whole theory depends on, shows you Bill during the exact period in question. And he is already the man we know. Same shape, same energy, Same total absence of anything resembling romantic prospects. He's shown watching Hank and Peggy through the window until they close the blinds, which is both extremely funny and extremely useful because it means we know exactly where Bill was standing on the relevant night, outside, looking in, being told to go away. There's no window in the timeline. Peggy has never once been anything other than repulsed by Bill, and she's rejected him on screen more times than I could count. The theory needs her to make one specific exception during the one specific period the show happens to have documented on film. Then there's the resemblance argument, which is the theory's main plank, and which actually works against it once you look properly. Bobby doesn't look like Hank, that's true. He looks like Cotton. In the war flashbacks, Cotton is essentially a taller, thinner, angrier Bobby with the same face. And G.H. Turco, or Cotton's other son, the one Cotton insisted on naming Good Hank, also looks like Bobby, which is exactly how genetics tends to work. Kids skip a generation in the face department all the time. Half the people you know look nothing like their parents and precisely like a photograph of a grandparent at the same age, and nobody has ever proposed a conspiracy about it. And then the practical objection, which for me is the one that ends the argument. This theory requires Bill Dauterive to keep a secret for 14 years. Bill cannot keep a secret for 14 minutes. He is the single most porous man in Texas. He tells people things they haven't asked about. He confesses to crimes he hasn't committed for the attention. There's an entire episode built on the premise that Bill, given even the smallest amount of social capital, will immediately spend all of it talking. The idea that this man has been sitting on the biggest piece of information in the neighborhood since the Reagan administration and has simply never mentioned it, not once, not even drunk in the alley at 2 a.m, is the least plausible thing anyone has ever asked me to believe about King of the Hill. And I say that having read a theory that Arlen is built over a hellmouth. So no, I don't buy it. But I do like what it's built on because the actual canon underneath is much sweeter than the theory is. The part of pregnant pause that tends to get skipped over is what happens next. After the fertility diagnosis, Peggy is devastated. Properly, quietly devastated, in a way the show doesn't usually let her be. And Hank, who has no vocabulary at all for this sort of thing, does the only thing he can think of. He goes and gets her a puppy. That's Ladybird. That's where the dog comes from. And Hank's own belief, stated out loud years later, is that playing with that puppy relaxed him enough that his condition eased, and they conceived Bobby. He genuinely thinks the dog did it. Which is why in the present-day story of that episode, he's throwing himself into getting Ladybird pregnant with such obsessive energy that Peggy assumes he cares more about the dog than about her. He doesn't. He's trying to run the exact same play twice. He thinks a puppy in the house fixed him once and might fix him again. That's such a specific, slightly daft, entirely believable thing for a man like Hank to believe. He does have therapy. He doesn't have language for any of it. What he has is one data point from 14 years ago and a working theory built on it. And he is going to follow that theory to the end. And there's a small structural thing I appreciate about how the show delivers all this. It doesn't sit you down. The fertility diagnosis, which is genuinely the most important piece of backstory the Hills have, arrives in the middle of an episode about a dog sandwiched between jokes and is then never made into a big thing. There's no dramatic music, nobody cries about it in a doorway. It's just information about these people's lives offered in passing, the way you'd learn it about actual neighbors, which is, incidentally, why the paternity theory bothers some fans so much. It takes something the show handled with a very light hand and turns it into a soap opera plot. King of the Hill was almost never a soap opera. It was a show about people whose lives contained 1 or 2 genuinely painful facts that they had absorbed and got on with. There's a nice mirror in the episode too, which I only noticed on about my 4th watch. Ladybird can't conceive because she has a narrow uterus. The dog has the same problem as the owner. The show never points at it, never has anyone comment on it, just puts it there and moves on. That's the level of care the writing room was working at on an episode whose B-plot is Dale taking a 4-hour course to become a bounty hunter and then eating tin pasta on a sofa at gunpoint with the man he's supposed to be arresting. There's a wrinkle to all this that I think is the funniest part, and it's that Bobby himself has worried about it. In that same episode, Bill develops an unexpected enthusiasm for Lady Bird's dog biscuits, and he weaponizes it. Bobby has got it into his head that he might not be his parents' bloodchild, which is a fairly standard bit of childhood paranoia and would have passed on its own. Bill, sensing an opening, encourages it. He sends Bobby off to a shop miles away to buy the biscuits at $26 a box on the strength of that anxiety. $26 in 1998 for dog biscuits that Bill is going to eat. So the show has, in the exact episode the paternity theory relies on, already put the question in Bobby's head and played the whole thing for laughs, which is either a deliberate wink or a coincidence, and I've never been able to decide which. Knowing this writing room, I'd lean towards deliberate. There's a joke response to the theory I've always enjoyed too. Somebody arguing against it simply pointed out that Hank does have a son. His name's Bobby. He's in the family tree. I'll leave that one alone. And the most straightforward rebuttal anyone's ever offered to the resemblance argument is also the shortest. Somebody posted a picture of Hank as a child and said it speaks for itself. It does, for the record. Young Hank is a round-faced kid with a bowl cut and no discernible chin. And if you put that image next to Bobby, you stop wondering about it entirely. The two of them stopped looking alike somewhere around the point Hank started playing football and never regained the weight he lost doing it. One last thought on the paternity thing before we move on. There's a variant of it that swaps Bill out for Cotton, which I'm mentioning mostly so you know it exists. Same reasoning, different man. It's built on the resemblance and on Cotton's soft spot for Bobby. It's also considerably nastier, requires you to believe some grim things about Cotton and Peggy that the show never suggests, and has even less to support it. I don't think it deserves much time. The resemblance is explained perfectly well by Cotton simply being Bobby's grandfather, which he is. Which does bring us around to Cotton, and honestly, we were always going to end up there. Because of everyone in Arlen, he's the one whose entire history comes to us secondhand, from a single, unreliable source, and that source is him. I've always found Cotton the most structurally odd character in the show, and it took me ages to work out why. It's this. Almost everything we know about him, we know because he said it. Loudly, usually at a dinner table, usually while insulting somebody. Hank was born well after the war. He never saw the version of Cotton that Cotton describes. Neither did Peggy, neither did Bobby, neither did anyone in Arlen except the veterans at the hall, and I'll come back to them because they are not what you'd call reliable witnesses. So the entire heroic biography of Cotton Hill rests on the testimony of a man who lies about small things constantly for entertainment. Fans noticed. And there is a whole cluster of theories here, some of them daft, one or two of them genuinely well argued, so let's go through them. The big one is simple. Cotton made it up. Not all of it necessarily, but the good bits. The 50 men, the shins, the whole legend. The theory says he was in the war in some lower capacity role, came home with an injury and a story, and spent the next 50 years inflating both because the alternative was going back to being nobody in particular. And the theory has one piece of evidence that's genuinely hard to wave off. There's an episode where Peggy tries to assemble Cotton's war record into a coherent timeline for a military cemetery application. And it doesn't work. The dates don't line up. He claims to have been in Munich 2 days before being in Okinawa, which is not a thing a man can do in 1945. And what I find fascinating is Cotton's reaction. He isn't smug about it. He isn't caught out and defiant. He seems genuinely surprised, like he'd never actually stress-tested his own stories against a calendar before. Which opens a third possibility that I think is the most interesting one. He's not lying and he's not telling the truth. He's an old man who's told the same stories so many times that they've drifted, and somewhere along the line, the drift stopped being deliberate. Anyone who's had an elderly relative with a fixed set of anecdotes will recognize that. The story gets a bit better every Christmas, and eventually nobody involved, including the teller, could tell you which version was the original. Now the counter-evidence, because it's stronger than the theory's supporters usually admit. Cotton holds decorations that aren't handed out casually. He achieved the rank of colonel in the Texas State Militia after the war, which is not the sort of thing you can bluff your way into because it leaves paperwork. And in the episode Death Picks Cotton, a doctor confirms there are bullets still lodged in his chest. Old ones. Rusting. You cannot fake being shot. You especially cannot fake it in a way that shows up on a scan decades later. And his application for the cemetery plot went through, which means somebody with access to actual records looked at the actual records and signed off. So the honest read, and this is where I land, is that Cotton is a liar and a war hero at the same time. Both things are true. He did the things, and then he spent the rest of his life embroidering them, and the embroidery got out of hand. That's a much better character than either the pure hero or the pure fraud. And I think it's what the writers were actually going for. That doctor's visit gives us the next theory, and it's one I have a soft spot for: the bullets. The idea is that decades of carrying rusting metal in your chest cavity would mean lead in the bloodstream, and lead poisoning does genuinely affect mood, impulse control, and aggression. So the theory holds that Cotton's whole personality, the shouting, the cruelty, the total absence of a filter, is at least partly a medical condition nobody ever diagnosed because he refused to see doctors. I don't think it's true. I think Cotton is just like that, and I think the show is fairly clear that he was like that before the war too, given how he talks about his own youth. But it's a nice bit of amateur pathology, and it does explain one thing neatly, which is why Cotton behaves marginally better when he's away from his usual environment. Though there's a much simpler explanation for that one, and it's coming up in a bit. Next, the theory that Cotton faked his own death. This exists because of a genuine wobble in the show's continuity. There's an episode, Cotton's Plot, where he earns himself a place in a state cemetery. Then later, after his death, Hank discovers Cotton was cremated and has to flush his ashes down a particular toilet, because Cotton's final wish was one last act of humiliation aimed at his eldest son. Those two things don't sit comfortably together. The fan explanation is that Cotton, a man who once obtained a Mexican driver's license with no apparent difficulty, simply arranged for somebody else's ashes to be in that urn and walked off into retirement free of his family forever. There's a lovely supporting detail people bring up. The toilet tank has a note saying Topsy was flushed down there. But Cotton had previously claimed he scattered Topsy's ashes over a prostitute. Both statements can't be fully true, so either Cotton split the ashes or Cotton was making it up. And if he was making that up, then he was capable of making up anything, including the contents of his own urn. It's circular reasoning, and it's completely unprovable, and I enjoy it enormously. It's also the only theory in this section that would actually be fun to see confirmed, because a Cotton who's been alive in a bungalow somewhere the entire time, occasionally reading about his own family, is a very funny idea. There's a tidier explanation for the burial contradiction going round, mind you, and it doesn't require Cotton to be alive. It just requires him to be Cotton. The idea is that he was buried at the state cemetery as arranged and separately left instructions, sending Hank on an errand with an urn full of somebody else's ashes, purely so that his son would spend an afternoon carrying a stranger's remains around a bus station. One final humiliation, scheduled in advance, to be delivered posthumously. That's not even a stretch. That's just a description of the man's hobbies. Last one in this cluster, and it's the busiest. The other sons. Cotton got around. That's canon, not theory. Junichiro exists, which confirms an affair in Japan. GH exists, And once you accept those two, fans start pointing at every other man in the show who happens to resemble Hank or sound like him. The usual suspects are Hal, the man who looked almost exactly like Hank and made Bill and Dale jealous, and the fellow at the Renaissance Fair who is voiced by Alan Rickman and has orange hair. Some people add Gerald Good to the pile. The general theory is that there are men scattered across Arlen and a fair chunk of the Pacific with horn-rimmed glasses, narrow urethras, and their father's complete inability to be pleasant. It's fun. There is, however, a fairly firm counterpoint sitting in season 14. The opening of the episode, No Hank Left Behind, has Cotton's sons receiving money from a class action lawsuit he'd been part of. And the sons who turn up are Hank, GH, and Junichiro joining by video call. That's it. 3. Now, that only tells you what the legal system knows about, and Cotton could easily have children nobody ever filed paperwork for. But if you're the sort of person who wants a canon answer, that's as close as you're going to get, and the canon answer is 3. There's a stranger theory sitting off to the side of that one, and I include it mainly because it explains something the show never bothers to. Cotton's other sons look like Hank. Junichiro looks like Hank. GH looks like Hank, which is fine, they're brothers. Except that Hank's face is generally taken to come from his mother's side, from Tilly rather than from Cotton. So how do half-brothers with different mothers all end up with Tilly's face? The theory's answer is that Cotton and Tilly were cousins, possibly first cousins, with some legal fudging around the marriage depending on what Texas allowed at the time. It's a properly uncomfortable proposal, and there's nothing in the show to support it beyond the resemblance, but I'll admit it's the only explanation anyone has offered for a genuine oddity in the character designs, which is that Cotton's children all look like each other, and none of them much look like Cotton. While we're here, one more piece of Cotton fallout that isn't strictly a theory, but gets treated as one. There's a strong argument that Cotton didn't just shape Hank, he shaped the whole alley. Cotton loves 3 things and only 3 things: guns, women, and war. And look at what Hank's friends became. Dale is president of the gun club with a collection that would concern most law enforcement agencies. Boomhauer spent his prime years working through the women of Arlen at a fairly startling rate. Bill joined the army specifically hoping to come home a hero. 1 trait each. Cotton took those boys places their own fathers didn't. And it's more or less confirmed in scattered dialogue that he did exactly that, including taking them to Hotel Arlen and buying them each a prostitute. All of them except Hank, who ran. That's the joke and the tragedy in one move. 3 men grew up to be a third of Cotton apiece. The one who's actually his son grew up to be the opposite of him and spent his life being told he was a disappointment for it. I'll give you one more small Cotton theory and then we'll leave the man alone because it's a good one and it takes 10 seconds. The theory is that Cotton knew perfectly well that Hank sells propane. He knew the whole time. He said Hank works at a gas station purely because it wound him up, and he kept saying it for years for the same reason. I believe that one completely. That is exactly, precisely how Cotton Hill operated. Here's the detail I actually love about all this, and it's not a theory, it's just true. If you write out Bobby Hill's family tree properly, it's enormous and slightly deranged. He's got 2 uncles who are also his father's half-brothers. He's got a step-grandmother, a step-grandfather, a cousin-in-law, a first cousin once removed. All of that on a show whose entire premise is that nothing much happens in a suburban Texas cul-de-sac, which is the thing about Cotton generally. He's the loudest man in the show, and he's also the source of nearly every complication in the Hill family. And the show is extremely clear about what he cost the people around him, especially Hank. And that's actually where I want to go next, because there's a whole category of theory that tries to explain what's going on inside Hank's head, and a surprising number of them lead straight back to his father. Here's a production detail I think about more than is reasonable. When Mike Judge sent the pilot to Fox, he'd written Hank as 49. The network came back and said no, he should be 32, because 32 was the average age of a Fox viewer. Judge got annoyed, sat with it for a bit, then submitted the exact same drawing and said, fine, he's 34. Nothing changed except the number. Which means the man you've been watching all these years was designed as somebody pushing 50 and then relabeled as somebody in his 30s for marketing reasons. And honestly, it shows. Hank has never once behaved like a man in his 30s. He behaves like a man who has been tired since 1974. I bring that up because it feeds into the biggest theory cluster about Hank, which is the one that tries to diagnose him. The most common version is that Hank is autistic or has Asperger's, depending on which decade the theory was written in. The evidence people put forward is fairly consistent. There's the intense, narrow, all-consuming interest in propane, which he can talk about indefinitely and which he uses as a conversational lifeline in social situations he can't otherwise navigate. There's a visible discomfort with anything sexual, to the point where he'd rather leave a room than finish a sentence. There's the flat emotional register and the difficulty with physical affection. And there's a favorite piece of evidence I do find funny, which is the episode where a video game gets made about Hank, and it's called Propane, and Hank assumes it's a spelling mistake. The pun does not land for him at all. He just quietly thinks somebody at the company can't spell. I understand why people find that compelling. I'm not sure it holds up as well as it looks, because there are perfectly ordinary explanations for every item on that list, and the show supplies most of them itself. The propane thing isn't really a fixation, it's loyalty. Hank has built over 20 years of self-worth on doing one job properly for one company in an economy that keeps telling him that sort of loyalty is stupid, and he refuses to accept that. That's not a symptom, that's a position. The emotional flatness is a man raised in the specific place and decade he was raised in by the specific father we've just spent 20 minutes discussing, who was taught before he could read that men don't discuss what they feel. The discomfort around sex is the same upbringing wearing a different hat. And as for missing the pun, well, I love Hank Hill dearly, but the man is not quick. He's decent and he's stubborn and he's got a good instinct for right and wrong. And none of that is the same as being sharp. There's a second diagnostic theory that I think fits noticeably better, and it comes up less often. Obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which is a different thing to OCD despite the name. The argument goes like this. It's a pattern built around perfectionism and control. People with it are often taken for workaholics. They put enormous weight on doing things properly, so much so that they can lose sight of why the thing was being done in the first place. They tend to be uncomfortable with emotional display from anyone, including themselves, because emotion is a loss of control. And they can be quite harsh about people who do things improperly. Read that back and try not to see Hank mowing a lawn. The detail that sells it for me is one somebody on a theory forum pointed out years ago, and I've never been able to unsee. Hank spends more time with his lawn, his truck, his grill, and his dog than with his family. And he is visibly more affectionate towards all four of them than he is towards any human being he's related to. Because the lawn can't emote back. The truck won't want a conversation about feelings. He can love those things at full volume with no risk whatsoever. That's a bleak little observation, and I think it's basically correct. But here's the version I actually believe, and it's the one the show more or less hands you without ever announcing it. There's nothing to diagnose. Hank is a profoundly anxious man who was raised by somebody cruel, and the anxiety has been sitting in his body since childhood. We already know his tension was severe enough to have physical consequences. That was the whole business in season 1. Chronic tension all the way down to the point where a doctor had to sit him in a chair and explain it to him. Now put that next to Cotton, who called his son a disappointment, routinely and at volume. Cotton, who named a later child Good Hank in front of the first one and said outright that the baby was the better son. Cotton, who took Hank's friends to a brothel as teenagers and mocked Hank for running away. Fans have connected those dots directly, and the version I keep seeing is genuinely a bit upsetting when you sit with it. Cotton didn't only leave Hank emotionally sealed shut, he may have caused physically the condition that nearly stopped Hank having a family at all. And there's a moment in a later episode where Cotton makes a point of saying he never had that particular problem himself, which is exactly the sort of thing Cotton would say. That's not a diagnosis, that's just damage. And I find it a much better explanation than any of the labels because it's the one the show has actually been building since the first season. Every single Hank and Cotton episode is about the same thing. A man in his 40s, still trying to get something from a father who is never, under any circumstances, going to give it to him. Before I get to the Kinder readings, there's one more physical detail worth putting in, because it comes up in these discussions and it's often got wrong. Hank's knees. He has ongoing trouble with them, and Cotton blames Tilly for it in the same breath he blames her for the fertility business, which tells you how Cotton allocated responsibility for anything inconvenient. But there's a much simpler explanation available. Hank played football seriously enough that it was the center of his identity, and he took an injury bad enough to end it. Knees in football have a long-standing arrangement, and it never goes well for the knees. I mention it because there's a version of the diagnosis theory that tries to bundle every physical thing about Hank into one grand explanation, and it doesn't need to. Some of it is his father, some of it is anxiety, some of it is just that he played a violent sport as a teenager and got older, like everyone does. There's also a theory floating around that Hank has straightforward OCD, which I'll deal with briefly because it's mostly a mislabeling. What people are describing when they say that is the ritual behavior, the lawn on a schedule, the specific way the grill is handled, the order things are done in. But those aren't compulsions in the clinical sense, they're routines, and the difference is whether the person is doing it because they want to or because something bad happens in their head if they don't. Hank mows his lawn on a schedule because he likes his lawn and he likes the schedule. That's not a disorder, that's Sunday. One thing I do think is worth naming, and I've never seen it get much attention. The show is quietly consistent about where Hank goes when things are bad. There are episodes including Moving On Up and Chasing Bobby, where you can watch him retreat from a difficult home situation into the lawn and the truck. Not as a hobby, as an escape. He goes out there and does maintenance because maintenance is a problem with a solution, and whatever's happening indoors isn't. That's a coping mechanism, and the show frames it as one without ever putting a word to it. I find that a lot more moving than any of the labels, because it's the sort of thing you'd only notice if you'd seen a real person do it. There's one more angle in this cluster I want to mention because it's a kinder one, and it comes from outside the fandom. The Economist, of all publications, once described Hank Hill as one of the wisest people on television. And Greg Daniels, who created the show with Judge, described Hank as based on neighbors he'd had. His phrasing was that Hank is upset about how America is changing and doesn't know what to do about it. There's a related reading from an academic who wrote about the show, comparing Hank to Archie Bunker and then identifying the difference. Archie never moved. Hank has the ability to acknowledge that the values he was raised with aren't sufficient to guide him anymore. As a father, a husband, a friend, or an employee. He doesn't like acknowledging it. He does it anyway, roughly once a season, usually in the last 4 minutes. And there was a piece in the New York Times in 2005 that made a similar point about his politics, which is that Hank never declares a party. He and the men in the alley don't talk like politicians. If he votes a particular way, it's because he doesn't see a real alternative on offer. The writer's conclusion was that Hank and his neighbors resemble a lot of independent voters, in that they're actually open to ideas that challenge their assumptions, provided the ideas don't arrive from somebody who's obviously sneering at them. That's a fairly precise description of the mechanism of about 80 episodes of this show. Somebody turns up with a new idea, Hank rejects it. The manner of the rejection depends almost entirely on how the person delivered it. 10 years into the run, a television critic described him as a man on the spot, caught between widening extremes, the ordinary bloke that politicians praise in campaign speeches and then forget about the moment they have won. He also noted that a character being this sharp a decade after his invention was more remarkable than the invention. I think that's the sharpest single sentence anybody has ever written about the character, and it does more work than any of the diagnostic theories manage. Hank isn't a puzzle to be solved. He's a man whose entire framework for how life is supposed to work was handed to him fully formed, and who keeps discovering that the framework doesn't cover the situation in front of him. And to his enormous credit, which the show gives him again and again, he usually adjusts. Slowly, reluctantly, with a lot of muttering. But he adjusts, which is more than most sitcom fathers of that era ever managed. Which brings me to a relationship that a lot of people have looked at very closely, and where Hank's inability to say what he feels produces something genuinely strange. Everyone gave up on Bill Dauterive years ago. That's just the situation. Dale is openly contemptuous of him. Boomhauer tolerates him. Peggy can barely be in a room with him. Bill's own relatives have, as far as we can tell, largely stopped answering. Hank never gave up on him, not once, across the entire run. He gets frustrated, he shouts, he occasionally has to physically remove Bill from a situation, but he has never actually walked away, and the show is quietly consistent about that in a way it doesn't make a fuss about. So the question fans have asked is why, and one answer that's built up a following is that Hank was in love with him. Let me get to the evidence, because it's more substantial than you'd expect. The centerpiece is the tattoo. The night before Bill shipped out with the army, Hank got Bill's name tattooed on him. That's not a fan invention, it's in the show. And the detail that makes people sit up is that Hank was going to have it done across his chest. Across the chest. There is no tattoo on the back of his head at all, because Boomhauer never talked any tattooist into putting Bill's name there in the first place. Boomhauer, in other words, understood in that moment that his mate was about to do something he'd have to explain forever, and quietly handled it. Then there's the way Hank talks about Bill when he thinks Bill has died. It's gushing. It's the warmest, least guarded language Hank uses about anybody in the entire series, from a man who cannot say a straightforward, affectionate sentence to his own son without adding a condition to it. Hank's actual verbal formula for affection towards Bobby is that if Bobby weren't his son, he'd hug him. That's what love sounds like coming out of this man's mouth. And then Bill turns up dead and Hank is suddenly eloquent. The theory holds that Hank developed feelings in high school that he had no framework for recognizing, in a place and a decade where recognizing them was not on the menu, and that those feelings never resolved. They just got filed under friendship and left there. Hank ended up with Peggy and genuinely loves Peggy, and the theory doesn't dispute any of that. It just suggests there's an unexamined thing underneath the loyalty. There's a companion theory that Bill is bisexual, which has a bit more on-screen support than you might remember. Bill spends an episode pretending to be gay to get work at a salon, and when he's rumbled, he immediately claims to be bisexual instead. Fans read that as a man reaching for the nearest true thing under pressure. There's also a moment in Three Coaches and a Bobby, a flashback where Coach Sowers kisses Bill on the mouth, and Bill looks briefly and unmistakably pleased about it. And his taste in women runs consistently towards older and more physically imposing, which some people read as a substitution. I want to be careful with this one because it's the sort of theory that can turn into a joke very quickly, and I don't think it deserves that. Both of these readings are affectionate. They're people who've watched the show closely, notice that the Hank and Bill relationship carries more weight than the writing officially assigns it, and come up with an explanation. That's what a good fan theory is. Do I believe it? Not literally, no. I think what's actually going on is a bit less dramatic and a bit sadder. I think Hank stays because Hank remembers. There's a flashback in the episode about Bobby's fashion show where we see teenage Hank, and he's not the man we know. He's picking on an overweight kid, he's a jock, he's a bit of a bully, and he's clearly enjoying himself. Bill, in that same era, was a genuine athlete, good-looking, popular, the one with prospects, which reverses the whole present-day dynamic. The Bill that Hank knew was the one going places, and Hank was the one hanging around him. There's a theory built on exactly that, incidentally, that Bill was a jerk in high school, that Hank probably was too, and that Hank's nostalgia has sanded all of it away so thoroughly that he can no longer see it. He remembers a golden version of both of them. And part of why he keeps turning up for Bill is that walking away would mean admitting the golden version is gone. That reading also gives you an explanation for a theory I ought to mention while we're here, which is that Hank has never been the upstanding figure he presents as, and that this is why every person he meets seems to expect the worst of him. The tattoo night is the evidence people point to. A young Hank getting drunk enough to permanently mark himself over a mate leaving town is not the behavior of the man who lectures Bobby about responsibility. Arlen, so the theory goes, remembers that version of him and has never fully updated its files. There's a detail from that same flashback era that supports the nostalgia reading rather than the romantic one, and it's worth putting in for balance. In the flashback where Hank gets the tattoo, Bill comes across as a decent bloke. Not a jock, not a bully, just a young man leaving town while his friend has a hard time about it, which sits awkwardly with the jerk in high school theory and suggests that whatever Bill was at school, he'd grown out of the worst of it by the time he shipped out. So the honest position is probably that Hank's memory isn't a fabrication. It's a memory with the edges knocked off, which is what memories are. He remembers a friend worth being upset about because that's what the friend was. There's one more adjacent theory in this cluster and it doesn't work, but people keep proposing it, so I'll deal with it briefly. The idea that Bill dated Peggy before Hank did, that she dumped him, and that everything since is a man circling something he lost. It's tidy and it's wrong. Peggy and Hank married almost immediately out of high school. Peggy only knew Bill through Hank in the first place, and Bill went straight into the army after graduating and then married Lenore. There's no gap in the calendar for it. Same problem as the paternity theory, actually. Everyone wants to put a secret relationship into a timeline that the show has already filled in. While we're on Bill, there's a theory about his family that I find genuinely unsettling and which the show more or less walked right up to. In the episode Blood and Sauce, Bill holds a family reunion and precisely one relative turns up, a cousin. And that cousin runs through what happened to everyone else on the family portrait. And the list is grim, a long catalog of physical and mental problems, and an entire row of the family marked as unable to have children. Then that same cousin makes it very clear she'd be willing to sleep with Bill. The fan conclusion is the obvious one, and the show is aware you're going to reach it. The Dottereeves have been marrying each other for generations, the family is collapsing under the weight of it, and Bill is what's left at the end of the line. That's a much darker piece of characterization than it first appears, and it recontextualizes a lot of Bill. It's not just that he's lonely, he's the last functioning member of a family that ran out of road, and the only relative willing to make the trip is offering him the one thing that would continue the pattern. There's a gentler theory that pairs with it about why Bill swings so wildly between despair and grandiosity. Give him the smallest amount of status and he becomes insufferable within about 4 minutes. He's briefly a war hero, briefly a celebrity barber, briefly a man with a girlfriend, and each time the personality change is total. The theory reads that as evidence he was somebody once and remembers it. He was a genuine athlete with genuine prospects, and every time a scrap of that returns, the old version comes surging back at full volume because it never actually went anywhere. It's been sitting in there the whole time waiting for a reason. Which, incidentally, gives you the answer to a question I always had, which is why Bill is still technically in the army. He is, across the entire run, he never left. He's a barber on a base, but he's serving, and he has been the whole time. The thing that was supposed to make him a hero became the thing he does on a Tuesday, and he stayed in it for 30 years anyway. I'd rather end this section on the nicest theory anyone has come up with about Bill, which isn't about his past at all. The proposal is that after everything, Bill eventually uses the GI Bill, goes to college, and becomes a counselor, works with people who are struggling, possibly with veterans. And the thing is, there's actual grounding for it. There's an episode called Bill's House where Bill turns out to be unexpectedly good at helping people, patient and warm and genuinely useful. And it's one of the few times the show lets him be competent at something without immediately taking it away. He knows what the bottom looks like from the inside. That's the whole qualification for that job. I've got no evidence it ever happens. It's pure wishful thinking on the fandom's part. But of every future anyone has imagined for these characters, that's the one I'd most like to be true. And I don't think the show would have found it implausible. Speaking of things everybody in the neighborhood knows and nobody says out loud, we should probably talk about Dale. There's an episode called Dog Dale Afternoon where Dale rigs a pellet gun to shoot anyone who comes near his new mower. Later that night, John Redcorn crawls through Nancy's bedroom window and sets it off. Dale comes out, sees Redcorn halfway through a window at night at his house, and says he knows what he's here for. Redcorn entirely reasonably panics and says this isn't how he wanted Dale to find out. And Dale tells him to stop messing about with his mower and to get inside and start massaging his wife. Redcorn's line afterwards is that Dale is taking some of the fun out of this, which is the closest the show ever comes to admitting what it's doing. And that scene, more than any other, is why an enormous chunk of this fandom believes Dale Gribble has known about Nancy and John Redcorn the entire time. I should say up front that this is the theory. If you asked 100 King of the Hill fans to name one, 90 of them would name this. It's got more versions than any other idea in the show, so let's go through them, softest to heaviest. The mild version is just that Dale knows and says nothing. That's it. No elaborate reasoning. He's clocked it. He's decided the marriage and the boy are worth more than the confrontation. And he's chosen the quiet life. Under this reading, all the alien abduction talk is Dale providing cover, and the paranoia is a costume he wears because it's more comfortable than the alternative. The version most people actually mean is considerably bigger than that, and it's the one that turned Dale into one of the more discussed characters in animated television. It goes like this. Dale has known since the beginning, not suspected, known. And rather than face it, he built himself an entire alternative reality to live in. The bounty hunting, the government conspiracies, the mercenary self-image, the certainty that he's a man feared by his enemies and desired by women. All of it, according to the theory, is architecture. It exists to occupy the space where the truth would otherwise sit. The alien abduction story is the load-bearing wall, because if Joseph came from aliens who used Dale's DNA, then Joseph is still Dale's, the resemblance to Redcorn is explained, Nancy is not unfaithful, and Dale is not a man whose wife chose somebody else. One story solves everything. And once you've built that, you have to keep building, because every year more people around you clearly know, and you need bigger explanations for why they're looking at you like that. The theory supporters point at his job as part of the pattern. A pest exterminator gets to kill things all day with total moral clarity and no risk of a physical confrontation with a person. They point at his refusal to wear protective equipment around poisons and his general recklessness, and read it as a man who isn't especially bothered whether he makes it to Friday. It's a compelling piece of writing, and I've seen people describe it as the best fan theory in television. I'll be honest, I think it goes too far. The version of Dale it produces is so unremittingly bleak that he stops being funny and Dale is funny, genuinely, reliably funny in a show where that's not easy. There's a limit to how much tragedy you can pour into a man whose defining trait is delight, and this theory blows past it. There's a middle version I like a lot more, and it does most of the same work with a fraction of the damage. Dale doesn't know about Nancy's affair, Dale doesn't especially mind, and Dale pretends not to know because if Nancy ever found out he knew, the arrangement would have to be discussed, and once it's discussed, she might leave and take Joseph with her. Redcorn has been fairly open about wanting a role in raising the boy. That's a real risk. Under this reading, Dale isn't deluded, he's negotiating. He's decided what he wants to keep, worked out the conditions required to keep it, and is maintaining those conditions daily through sheer performance. That's not a broken man. That's a man making a difficult call and sticking to it for over a decade, which is arguably the most competent thing anybody in Arlen does. Then there's the grimmer variant, which is about everyone else rather than Dale. The idea that Hank and the others don't tell him because they've concluded he couldn't survive it. The evidence usually cited is how badly Dale falls apart in Dog Dale Afternoon over something as small as Hank stealing his mower as a prank. If that's what a missing lawnmower does, the reasoning goes, then 13 years of marriage would finish him. I'm not convinced. He's rattled in that episode, certainly, and he loses track of time. But he also drops everything and gets straight to work the moment Nancy tells him he's got a job at the community college, which isn't the behavior of a man on the edge. Bill misreads the situation from a distance and assumes the worst, which is very Bill, and the show plays it for exactly that. There's one specific objection to the elaborate version that I've never seen answer properly, and I think it's the strongest one going. If Dale has constructed his whole life to avoid the fact that his wife chose somebody else, why does he never stray himself? There's an episode with an exterminator who is quite clearly interested in him, and he doesn't so much as register it as an option. The answer his defenders give is that whatever else is going on, Dale is fiercely loyal, and that's true, and it's consistent across the whole run. But it does undercut the theory a bit. A man building an elaborate psychological structure around a wound usually acts out somewhere. Dale doesn't. Dale goes home. He is, by some distance, the most faithful husband in the show, and it's never played as ironic, which pushes me towards the simplest reading of all, and I'll say it, even though it's the least fun one. Maybe Dale genuinely doesn't know, and that's the joke. He's paranoid about everything on Earth except the one thing happening in his own house. And the irony is the whole point. There's an argument that if he did know and had known for over a decade, he'd have cracked. He'd have done something. He isn't a man who sits on things, and honestly, Dale seems content. That's the bit that gives me pause about the tragic reading. He lives largely off Nancy's income. He takes visible pride in his extermination work even when he's underselling himself, and he appears to be enjoying his life. I struggle to find as much darkness in there as the theory needs. Now there's a piece of this that hardly ever comes up. Nancy. There's a theory that Nancy's hair loss is the physical cost of carrying the secret, and whether or not that's what the writers intended, it's the right instinct. Nancy is the one person in this arrangement who has no plausible deniability at all. Dale might not know. Joseph doesn't know. Everybody else has the luxury of it being somebody else's business. Nancy wakes up inside it every day. Whatever's going on with Dale, she's the one paying interest. And then there's Joseph, who I think is quietly the most interesting person in this whole thing because you can actually watch him work it out. In season 5, he's told in the vaguest possible terms that in a weird way, he and John Redcorn are related. That lands and it sits there. A season later comes the alien episode, where he and Dale arrive together at the conclusion that aliens used Dale's DNA. Dale seems entirely satisfied by this. Joseph does not. Joseph looks like a boy agreeing to something because his dad needs him to agree to it. And by season 7, in Vision Quest, Joseph is treating Redcorn with a specific kind of respect and wanting to go to him for guidance on spiritual matters, which he'd never bothered with a couple of seasons earlier. Dale interrupts before it goes anywhere. But the trajectory is there and it's not accidental, which is a very sweet resolution to the whole thing when you think about it. The theory says Dale built a story so his son could have a father, and the son appears to have quietly accepted the story for the same reason, so his dad could have a son. They're both doing it. Neither of them is going to say so. As for where things stand now, there's one genuine data point from the revival. There's a season 14 episode that gets into Dale's list of people he trusts, and John Redcorn is on it. Do with that what you will. It doesn't confirm anything on its own, and Dale's trust list is not a document assembled under rigorous conditions. But it's not nothing, and it's the closest the show has come in nearly 30 years to putting a thumb on the scale. There are a couple of smaller Dale theories worth collecting while we're here. and one of them I think is genuinely correct. The first is about his grandmother, and it exists to solve a puzzle. Dale is a right-wing militia enthusiast in Texas with a substantial arsenal and a filing cabinet full of government conspiracies. And he is notably not racist at all. Not in the casual background way that several other characters occasionally are. One theory explains this by making his grandmother Jamaican, which would also account for his entirely unbothered reaction to Nancy giving birth to a dark-skinned baby. A competing version says Filipino, on the grounds that Dale demonstrably knows some Tagalog and has never offered any explanation for why. And then somebody in the middle of all this wrote the response that I think settles it, which was simply, or he's just not racist. Which, yes, there's a strain of fan theorizing that treats every decent quality a character has as a mystery requiring a solution, and it's worth resisting. Dale reads much more as a libertarian than anything else. He doesn't much care what anyone does as long as nobody's doing it to him. And his position on gay people is more relaxed than any other adult man on the show, which is not a high bar, but he clears it comfortably. One of his gun club members is black and gay, and Dale has no issue with either fact. He's a paranoid militia hobbyist who happens to be broadly fine with people, and that combination is funnier and truer than any ancestry theory. The second small one is about the cigarette. Dale claims at one point to have lit a cigarette by banging two rocks together. Everyone treats it as bluster. The theory says he's telling the truth, and the argument is specific. Dale has never once lied about smoking. He lies about everything else constantly. But smoking is the one area where he's completely honest, and he has a documented history of lighting cigarettes off whatever's available. I love that. Somebody sat down and worked out which categories Dale Gribble is truthful in. That's the level we're operating at. There's also a theory that Dale is on the autism spectrum, cited alongside the ones about Hank we covered earlier. The evidence given is the obsessive interests, awkward motor control, and highly developed language paired with poor social judgment. And there's an interesting objection to it, which is that Dale usually seems to understand exactly what he's doing socially. He's not misreading rooms, he's choosing to behave that way and finding the results entertaining. I'll mention the daftest theory in this cluster for completeness, that John Redcorn is not an alien, and Joseph therefore is not part alien after all, meaning Dale is accidentally right about aliens but wrong about Redcorn. And an even sillier one where Redcorn is a time-traveling version of Dale himself, which Dale secretly knows, which is why he considers Joseph his son and covers by claiming Redcorn is gay. That last one is nonsense, and I'm quite fond of it. My own view, for what it's worth, I don't want this one answered. There are a small number of jokes in television that only work as long as nobody explains them, and this is one. The moment the show tells you definitively what Dale knows, half the scenes in the back catalog change meaning. And not necessarily for the better. Anyway, that's The Neighbors. It's probably worth asking a broader question about the town they all live in because there's a theory about Arlen that reframes the entire series, and I find it genuinely persuasive. The more of the show I watch, the more one thing nags at me. Hank is never really wrong, not never ever. He's wrong about Bobby constantly, and the show is happy to say so. But on the week's actual issue, the thing the episode is about, Hank tends to be right, and everybody who disagrees with him tends to turn out to be an idiot, a fanatic, or a con artist. Fans noticed this decades ago and built a theory on it, and the first version is that Hank is cursed. The argument is that Hank is doomed to only ever encounter the worst available example of anything he's skeptical about. He'll never meet a reasonable person who plays tabletop games as a normal hobby. He gets the one who takes it too seriously. He'll never meet a soccer coach who treats the sport sensibly. He'll never meet a well-argued liberal. Every single person on the other side of every disagreement he has is a caricature. What makes this more than a joke is what the theory does with it. It suggests this is precisely why Hank is as narrow as he is. He never adjusted his views because life never gave him a reason to. If literally every person who's ever challenged your worldview has been an obvious lunatic, then holding your position is the rational response to the available evidence. He's not closed-minded because he refuses to learn. He's closed-minded because the universe has been feeding him a rigged sample his entire life, which is a lovely inversion, and I do have a small objection to it, which is that Hank doesn't exactly go looking. He isn't out in the world encountering a range of people and finding them all wanting. He drinks in an alley with the same 3 men he's known since school. There's an episode where he writes interview questions specifically designed to filter out people he'd find awkward to work with, and turns down a perfectly capable applicant partly because she didn't know football. The sample being rigged and Hank rigging it are not mutually exclusive. Then there's the version that turns the curse around and points it at the town. Because people outside Arlen are a bit odd, sure, but the properly deranged ones are all in Arlen. The theory asks why the concentration is so high in one suburb and offers 2 explanations: something in the water, or Arlen is built on a hellmouth. I'm obliged to point out that somebody proposed calling the show King of the Hillmouth, which I think about more often than I'd like to admit. The evidence people give is that cotton behaves noticeably better outside Arlen, which is true, though I'd suggest that being away from Hank probably accounts for most of it, since a good percentage of Cotton's worst behavior exists purely to get a reaction out of his son. And then there's the third version, which folds both of the others into it, and which I think is actually correct. The whole show is told from Hank's point of view, he just doesn't narrate it. That's it. That's the theory, and it explains everything the other 2 are trying to explain without needing a curse or a hellmouth. Hank isn't unusually right. We're watching his account of events. He's an honest man, so the show doesn't paint him as flawless, and we see him being unreasonable regularly. But he considers himself decent and sensible, and so the world we're shown is the world as it looks to somebody who considers himself decent and sensible. The people who disagree with him look ridiculous because that's how they look to him. The reason I find this persuasive is that the show has demonstrated the mechanism on screen. There's an episode called A Firefighting We Will Go, where the men give conflicting accounts of the same night. And each account is animated, and in Dale's version of events, Dale has significantly more hair. That's the show telling you outright that what you're watching is somebody's version. Once you've established that a character's self-image visibly rewrites the picture, you've handed the audience permission to ask whose version the rest of it is. The same episode gives us the other famous bit of evidence, which is Boomhauer's account. In Boomhauer's version, Boomhauer speaks perfectly clearly and articulately, and everyone else is a fast-talking mumbler nobody can follow. I love that gag. Absolutely no notes. It's the funniest 30 seconds in the show, and it's also, if you're paying attention, a fairly serious piece of information, because it establishes that these people do not experience each other the way we experience them. Since we're on the subject of how people in Arlen experience each other, there's a theory about the feuds that I think is almost certainly right. Con and Min spend a great deal of the show insulting the neighbors loudly in front of them and never getting called on it. The theory is that they're speaking Laotian, and it's being dubbed into English for our benefit. The evidence is that when we're shown an argument from another character's point of view, they're usually speaking Laotian in that version. There's a sensible refinement to it, which is that it's probably true sometimes rather than always. Khan mentions early on that they'd been in the country roughly 20 years by then, and the pair are visibly disconnected from Lao culture. Connie can barely tell the difference between a greeting and an insult in the language, which suggests it isn't spoken at home much. So the reading most people land on is that it's what comes out when they're angry or when they're talking to each other, and the rest of the time everyone in the alley has simply grown numb to being insulted and stopped reacting, which is a very Arlen solution to a problem, not addressing it, just absorbing it until it stops registering. And that leads into the darkest reading anyone has of a main character, which I'll put here rather than saving it, because it belongs with the town. The theory is that Peggy Hill is a sadist. The evidence is not thin. There's the Flat Stanley business, where she takes a paper figure sent home from a school project and subjects it to an ordeal, ostensibly to teach children about safety. Except the things she's warning them about are so obvious that the lesson can't be the point. Stanley gets shot, gets gored, gets crushed, survives all of it, which somehow makes it worse. Then there's the scrapbook. Peggy collects newspaper clippings of fatal accidents and keeps them, and Hank finds it disturbing, which is a fair signal because Hank finds almost nothing about his wife disturbing. And there's an episode where she describes a dream in which she murdered Principal Moss, and the way she tells it does not suggest she found the experience upsetting. Now, I don't think the show intends Peggy to be a sadist. I think the show intends Peggy to have an enormous, poorly regulated ego and a slightly morbid streak. And those two things in combination produce moments that look alarming when you line them up out of context, which is exactly what a fan theory is, someone lining things up out of context. But I'll grant that the scrapbook is genuinely odd, and nobody has ever offered a better explanation for it than the theory does. There's a companion piece to it, incidentally, and it's a much smaller claim. In Bobby Goes Nuts, when Bobby learns to kick people and Peggy puts a stop to it by telling him it doesn't work on women, the theory says she was wearing a cup. She anticipated it and prepared. And she then told him a lie to permanently disarm him. That's about 100 times more calculating than the scene appears on first watch, and it fits her perfectly. There's one more theory in this cluster that I want to end on because it's generous, and there aren't many generous fan theories. A common complaint about the show is that Hank never learns. Every dozen episodes, he has to relearn the lesson about accepting Bobby. And by season 9, you'd think it might have stuck. The counter theory is that it isn't the same lesson. Hank isn't failing to retain a general principle about accepting his son. He's accepting each thing individually, one at a time, because he's a man who has to be walked through every single case separately. Bobby does prop comedy, and Hank has to get there. Bobby wants to cook, and Hank has to get there again from scratch. Bobby models clothing. Bobby joins a Christian rock band. Bobby takes up rodeo clowning, and each one is a separate negotiation. There's a small piece of evidence for the point of view theory hiding in this too. If we're watching Hank's account, then the reason we keep seeing the same lesson is that Hank keeps having to learn it, and he's the one telling us. A more flattering narrator would have edited some of those out. The fact that the show keeps showing us Hank getting it wrong about his son over and over for 13 years is arguably the strongest argument that he's an honest narrator rather than a self-serving one. And there's a scene that backs this up beautifully. During the Christian rock episode, Hank shows Bobby a box of things the family has tried and given up on. He tells Bobby he doesn't want his faith to end up in that box, which means Hank is fully aware of the pattern. He knows most of Bobby's enthusiasms end up in there. He's not deluded about it. He's just decided that this particular one might be worth the trouble. That's a man doing the work slowly in the only way he knows how. And I'd take that over a character who learns a tidy lesson in 22 minutes and has it stick forever, because the second thing has never once happened to anybody I've ever met. Right, Boomhauer, he's earned a section of his own, partly because of the finale and partly because the story of where his voice came from is genuinely one of my favorite pieces of television trivia. The voice is real. That's the thing I love most about it. Back in the Beavis and Butthead days, Mike Judge got a message left on his answering machine by an irate man. Judge assumed the fellow was complaining about Beavis and Butthead. He wasn't. He was complaining about the scheduling of Looney Tunes, which he was referring to by a name I'm not going to say, and he was doing it in a fast, rambling, almost entirely unparsable drawl. Judge kept it. And when they were building King of the Hill, that voice became Boomhauer. It goes further than that, actually. In the pilot, when Boomhauer is on the phone to a social worker complaining about the neighbor's dog, and he says he's been calling these people better than a month now, that's lifted more or less directly from the voicemail. Judge has told the story on Kimmel. An entire beloved character, one of the most quoted in American animation, exists because a stranger rang a cartoonist to shout about cartoon scheduling. I don't know. I find that genuinely delightful. Nothing about it should have worked. Now, The theories, and this is the one section where fans got a proper result. For 13 seasons, nobody knew what Boomhauer did for a living. He's around during the day, he's got money, he's got a car and a house, and no visible source of either. And the show never really addressed it until the series finale, which for a series this detail-obsessed was conspicuous, so people theorized. And one of the theories was that Boomhauer must have police connections because there's no other way to explain how the men in that alley have stayed out of custody. Consider what Dale gets up to across the run. Consider Buck Strickland, whose behavior spans a genuinely impressive range of offenses. Consider Cotton, who by any reasonable standard should have been arrested several times a season. And yet nothing ever really lands on any of them. The theory's conclusion was that somebody with pull is quietly smoothing it over, and Boomhauer is the only candidate. Then the finale aired and showed you his driver's license, and it turns out Boomhauer is a Texas Ranger, which is one of the great late reveals, and it's presented with almost no ceremony. It's just there on a card in the last episode, and then the show ends. Naturally, the moment it aired, a counter theory appeared saying the badge is fake. The reasoning is decent. Being a Texas Ranger comes with real requirements, including a background in law enforcement, and there's no evidence of that anywhere in Boomhauer's life. Ranger status would also create some awkward questions about all the things he's watched his friends do without intervening. And there's an episode where he gets held for observation, which is not a thing that would leave a state law enforcement career intact. The counter theory says the badge is a forgery he carries around to help him pick up women, which is, I have to admit, extremely in character. The revival appears to settle it. He's a retired Texas Ranger living a retired Texas Ranger sort of life and getting on rather well. He's spending time with the sheltered son of his new girlfriend, introducing the lad to alcohol-free beer and soccer and the concept of playing outside while the grown-ups drink in the alley. He picks up work through an app that sends people out to fix things until an injury takes him out of it, and Hank ends up doing app work instead. And he and Hank spend a decent portion of the season clashing over how he's coaching the boys' soccer team. Of everyone in that alley, Boomhauer seems to have landed the softest. He always did give the impression of a man who'd sorted something out that the others hadn't. What I find interesting about the Ranger reveal is what it does to the police connections theory retroactively. Because the theory wasn't just guessing his job, it was proposing a mechanism. And the mechanism was that somebody has been quietly protecting these men for years. And the show never confirms that part. It confirms the job and leaves the implications sitting there untouched, which is arguably worse, because now you have to decide for yourself whether Boomhauer has been intervening on his friend's behalf, or whether he's simply been standing in an alley for 2 decades watching Dale commit a steady stream of minor offenses and choosing every single time not to be a police officer about it. I think it's the second one. I think Boomhauer decided early that his job stops at the property line, and that whatever Dale is doing with fireworks and unlicensed pest chemicals is not a state matter. Which is, when you consider what he'd have had to overlook, an act of enormous friendship conducted entirely through inaction. Now, the speech. There are theories about it, and I want to be a bit careful here because one of them is a diagnosis nobody asked for. The proposal that keeps circulating is that Boomhauer has a form of OCD affecting his speech. The most thorough response I've read to that came from somebody who actually has the condition, and their point was simply that this isn't how it presents. Compulsions don't work like that. If you wanted a medical explanation, you'd be looking at a speech difference, not an anxiety disorder. And their supporting argument is the good one. Boomhauer, in his own account of events, hears himself speaking normally. He isn't aware of any impediment. He experiences everyone else as the ones mumbling incoherently. The killer detail, though, has nothing to do with medicine. His grandmother talks exactly the same way. So does his brother Patch, who is voiced by Brad Pitt, which is a sentence I enjoy typing. So it's not a condition, it's a family. That's just how the Boomhauers talk, and everyone else in Arlen has decided to live with it. which makes the other stuff about him funnier because Boomhauer is not remotely limited. He sings bluegrass, and when he sings, he's perfectly clear. He speaks fluent French, well enough to conduct a romance in it. His mother wanted him to become an electrical engineer, and you get the impression he could have. That combination is the actual joke of the character, and I think it took me years to properly get it. Boomhauer is not the dim one. He was never the dim one. He's arguably the most capable and best adjusted man in that alley, and the only reason nobody knows it is a delivery problem. He's a state law officer with a second language, a singing voice, and an active social life, standing next to a conspiracy theorist and a barber. And the three of them are treated by everyone as roughly equivalent. There's a running thread across the series where Boomhauer says something true and important, and it simply doesn't register with anyone. The best example is when he tells the fire chief that Dale was the one who plugged in the faulty Alamo beer sign, and the chief doesn't follow, so the blame gets pinned on electrical faults and a dead man's reputation is preserved. Boomhauer solved it. Nobody understood him. Everyone carries on with their day. A few more details before the theories, because the small facts about Boomhauer are better than most of the speculation. His first name is Jeff. That gets said out loud a few times across the entire original run, including in a season 13 episode when a Canadian woman he swapped houses with greets him by it. And his driver's license in the finale, the same one that reveals the ranger business, just says Boomhauer, Jeff. 13 seasons for a first name, and the show gives it up in passing during a house swap. His singing voice, when he does sing, is provided by Vince Gill, which explains why the bluegrass sounds as good as it does. And there's a running continuity oddity that fans have cataloged, which is that the location of his house moves, not once, repeatedly. Where Boomhauer lives depends on which episode you're watching and what the storyboard needed that week. Nobody has built a theory on that as far as I know, which surprises me slightly, because it's exactly the sort of thing this fandom usually pounces on. Now the theory I've saved because it's the silliest and it comes up constantly. Boomhauer is Patty Mayonnaise's father. That's it. That's the whole theory. Patty Mayonnaise from Doug, a completely unrelated cartoon on a different network made by different people. The reasoning, as far as I can reconstruct it, is the hair color and a general vibe. It's completely unsupported, and I've seen it argued in earnest more than once. I include it because it's a useful demonstration of where fan theorizing ends up if you follow the method far enough. You start with something reasonable, like wondering how the men in that alley have avoided prison. You get a genuine answer 13 years later. And somewhere along the way, somebody proposes a paternity claim across a network boundary. 2 more small ones, and then we'll leave him alone. First, he dyes his hair. He admits it, in an episode called Hank's On Board, in the tone of a man making a confession. That matters because there's a theory that a boy in Bobby's class is Boomhauer's illegitimate son, based on the kid having a similar skin tone and hair color, which collapses immediately because Boomhauer's coloring is not genetic. He is heavily tanned and he dyes it. There's a stronger version of the same theory though, which is that Garth in the season 1 episode Order of the Straight Arrow was originally meant to be his son, and that the writers thought better of it and pretended it never came up. Second, and I think this is the strangest unexplored thing in the entire show, there's a line in season 4 confirming that Boomhauer has known Peggy for longer than Hank has. That's it. That's all we get. He presumably introduced them. It's never elaborated on, never revisited, never mentioned again by anyone. The man who was there at the beginning of the central relationship of the series is standing in the alley for 13 years saying nothing about it. I'd watch a whole episode about that. I suspect I'm going to be waiting. Anyway, since we've just been discussing 13 years of continuity, there's a problem with the timeline we should probably address, because the timeline does not work at all. Luann arrives at the Hills house at 19. Over the following season, she turns 21, has a birthday party for it, drops out of and returns to community college, gets engaged, gets married, and has a daughter. Bobby, over the same stretch of time, ages roughly 2 years and does not change shape. That's the problem, laid out as plainly as I can put it, and it's not confined to Bobby. John Redcorn shouts at Nancy at one point that he's 36 and doesn't need this, and then several seasons later complains to Hank about being 40. Which would be fine, except that Bobby is still in middle school on both occasions. Most shows do this and nobody minds. Sitcom time is elastic, everyone understands the deal, and you don't sit there with a spreadsheet. But King of the Hill is unusually grounded, and the fandom is unusually detail-minded, so instead of shrugging, people built explanations. Some of them are quite dark. Let's go through them. The famous one is that Bobby died. The theory places it shortly after his 13th birthday or shortly after the breakup with Connie, depending on the version. Everything after that is a dying dream, and the argument for it is that this is exactly when the show's dynamic changes. Before that point, nearly everything Bobby does is against Hank's wishes, and Hank pushes back on all of it. After that point, Hank starts accepting things. He softens. He begins finding common ground, which the theory says is not character development. It's a boy dreaming the version of his father he wanted. And the series finale, where Hank and Bobby finally connect over meat of all things, is the last moment of that dream. There's a supporting detail people bring up that's genuinely a bit unsettling. In the episode where Bobby gets mistaken for a high schooler and invents a story about having a kidney condition, he ends up telling someone who's asking after Kidney Boy that Kidney Boy died. Now, that's a joke. It is clearly, obviously a joke, and I want to be firm about that because this theory has a tendency to get presented as though the show planted it. It didn't, but you can see why the line stuck in people's heads. There's a variant that goes the other way. Bobby didn't die, everyone else did. Hank and Luann both died in the Megalomart explosion. Peggy, grieving, was given a skydiving lesson by Bobby as an anniversary present and died doing it. Bobby ends up in the custody of Cotton or his grandmother Tilly, keeps in touch with Joseph and Connie by phone, and spends his time daydreaming what life would have been like if any of them had survived. The theory then claims the show's weaker later seasons are Bobby settling into a happier, less detailed fantasy. I'll be honest, that one annoys me slightly, mostly because of the last bit. Explaining a decline in writing quality as an in-universe character choice is a move I've never much liked. It lets the theory take credit for something that's just television. There's a third in the same family, which is that Bobby is imagining all of it after the explosion, and that everyone gets stupider and meaner as he drifts closer to dying. The supporting evidence is the episode where Buckley turns up as an angel to Luann, read as her wanting a guest spot in her own daydream. It's neat. It's also, like the others, unfalsifiable. And I noticed that all three of these theories are basically the same theory with a different name in the middle. The one I actually enjoy is next because it's completely absurd and it's internally consistent, which is my favorite combination. Bobby never hits puberty because of the deer. In Good Hill Hunting, the whole business of a boy's first kill is treated as an enormous rite of passage with a lot of weight placed on it by every adult male in the vicinity. And Bobby does end up with a dead deer, but he doesn't shoot it deliberately. It's an accident. So the theory says the rite didn't take. Bobby technically failed the ritual, and in the specific universe of this show that carries a consequence. He stays 13. Joseph, who presumably managed his properly, shoots up in height, grows a mustache, and drops 2 octaves practically overnight. Connie gets older. Bobby just stays where he is. It's nonsense. It's completely unsupported by anything. And it has better internal logic than most of what I've read tonight because it explains the specific pattern rather than a general one. It's not asking why nobody ages, it's asking why one particular boy doesn't while the children around him plainly do. Then there's the Peggy question, and this one comes up so often it's practically doctrine. Peggy in the first 3 seasons is recognizably a different person. She's warm, she's decent, she's got an ego, but it's occasional, and it's funny. From season 4 onward, the ego and the obliviousness become her dominant traits and stay there. The theory attributes it to the skydiving accident in season 4, where her parachute didn't open. head injury, personality change. Fans have pointed out that her Spanish, which was never good, gets noticeably worse afterwards, which is the sort of thing a spreadsheet-minded fandom notices, and the rest of us do not. There's a psychological alternative that I prefer. Nothing was damaged. Peggy simply survived falling out of the sky, and it did to her what surviving something like that would do to a lot of people. She came out of it feeling invincible. She'd been given proof that the universe had singled her out and let her live, and everything after that is a woman acting on that information. I'd like that considerably more, partly because it doesn't require a medical event to explain a writing choice, and partly because it's just more interesting. A woman made insufferable by a near-death experience is a real thing that happens. Brain damage is a way of saying the character got worse and having a reason not to think about it. The same theory gets applied to Luann, incidentally, with the megalomart explosion as the cause, and her taking photographs of a television news broadcast in an attempt to become a photojournalist as the first symptom. And there's a sadder reading where her later behavior is a response to Buckley's death rather than the explosion, which I think is closer to what the show was going for, given that it did actually let her grieve on screen for a while. There's a counter-argument to the Luann version that I think is correct and that gets forgotten. Luann stayed in community college for several seasons after the explosion, of her own initiative, and she was demonstrably capable during that period. If a head injury had scrambled her, it did so with remarkable patience. What actually seems to happen is that her judgment about people declines, while her general intelligence stays roughly where it was, which is a different thing entirely and looks a lot more like someone repeatedly getting hurt than someone getting concussed. The daftest version of all of this, and the one I'll finish on, blames the manger babies. The theory being that the puppets are made of something toxic and that Luann has been slowly poisoned by proximity to them. There's no evidence, there's no mechanism, nobody has proposed which material. It exists purely because someone noticed the timing lined up and thought it was funny, which is, I'd argue, a perfectly respectable reason for a theory to exist. Since we're on what happens to these characters over time, there's a whole cluster of theories about where Bobby ends up, and they're worth going through because the fandom split into camps about it years, before anyone knew there'd be a revival. Camp 1 has Bobby becoming a social worker in Arlen. The reasoning traces back to the finale, where an experience with a girl leaves him thinking a bit better of himself and prompts Hank to say more than 4 consecutive words of encouragement, which for Hank is a speech. The theory extrapolates from there into a career helping troubled teenagers and adds that he marries Connie and she works as his assistant. That last bit got demolished immediately and rightly. Connie has stated on screen that she wants to go into journalism, and she's under enormous pressure from Khan and Min to achieve. And the idea that she'd end up as anyone's assistant is a misreading of the entire character. That objection is one of my favorite bits of fandom pedantry because it's someone defending a fictional teenager's career prospects with real heat. Camp 2 has Bobby joining the army and out-decorating Cotton. The argument for it is better than you'd expect. Bobby is an excellent marksman, established repeatedly. He has real determination when something matters to him, which you can see when he steals the Belton armadillo and again when Cotton puts him in the hole. And the image of Bobby as a sniper delivering his catchphrase in that voice is, I'll admit, funny enough to keep the theory alive on its own merits. Camp 3, and this is the one that turned out closest in spirit, has Bobby in comedy. A successful comedian and cartoonist making shows based on his own life, with Connie becoming a businesswoman more formidable than her father, and eventually dismantling the Wassanasong family business in revenge for how they treated him. That last part is a considerably more vengeful ending than King of the Hill was ever going to produce. But the underlying instinct that Bobby's future is in something creative and food adjacent and entirely unlike his father's was correct. There's a Stranger Time theory I want to include because it's the most elegant thing in this whole section, and it takes a moment to explain. In the episode where Bobby is thought to be the reincarnated Lama Senglug, an old monk comes to make the final determination. everything points to Bobby being the llama. Bobby chooses Connie instead, and the monk accepts his own decision and says quietly, watching them walk away, that it was his choice and he made it. The theory says the old monk is Bobby, that if Bobby really was Sanglug, he'd be reincarnated after death, and he came back as a monk born several decades before Bobby was. So when he arrives in Arlen, he's meeting his own earlier life, and he recognizes the exact moment he chose the girl over the calling. That's genuinely lovely. It's built entirely on one line of dialogue, and it requires nothing that contradicts the episode. Of everything I've read putting the script together, that's the theory I'd most like the writers to have intended. One last small one, and it's about a minor character. Coachy Sowers, whose behavior at the end of his episode escalates from merely appalling to actively trying to run children over with a car. The theory is that he's concussed. He does that immediately after driving his helmeted head into a brick wall to demonstrate the helmet's quality. And the theory says the head injury is what tips him from unpleasant into dangerous, which is either a fan being charitable to a terrible man or the single most reasonable explanation anyone has offered for a King of the Hill plot. Possibly both. Now, there's one more family of theories to get through, and it's the only one with an actual confirmation attached to it, because Mike Judge did at one point plan to connect this show to another one entirely. This is the only section tonight where the headline theory comes with a receipt attached. So let's start with that and work outwards into the daft stuff. If you've watched Beavis and Butthead, you'll know Tom Anderson. He's the disapproving old neighbor, the one who's constantly having his property destroyed by two teenagers he can't quite comprehend. He's also, and this is the important bit, voiced by Mike Judge. And if you look at Hank Hill and listen to Hank Hill, the resemblance is not subtle. Same posture, same glasses, same drawl at a slightly different pitch. Television critics clocked it the moment King of the Hill premiered. One of them wrote at the time that Hank still looked and sounded like a young Mr. Anderson, only more in touch with the modern world and funnier, which is a fair summary. Then, in a 2006 interview, Judge said it outright. The original plan was for Hank to be Tom Anderson's son. He'd been thinking of tying it to Beavis and Butthead as a sort of spin-off. Fox said no, and I've always thought that was the right call, for what it's worth, even though I'd have watched it. Hank works because Arlen is sealed. The moment you attach him to another cartoon's continuity, he stops being a man in a suburb and starts being a piece of a franchise, and this show was never built to carry that. That's the whole story. It's not a theory, it's a thing that nearly happened and didn't. And everything else in this section is the fandom trying to build something in the space that decision left behind. The most persistent attempt runs the connection the other way around. It claims Beavis and Butthead takes place in Arlen's future. The narrative goes like this. King of the Hill ended because Hank got tired. He stopped going on adventures, he became difficult to live with, and eventually Peggy divorced him. Hank, wrecked by it, moved away. Years later, older and worn down, he met a calm woman named Mrs. Anderson, and because he no longer felt much like a man, he took her surname. And that's how you get Tom Anderson. I'll give it this. It's committed. It has an emotional arc. Somebody put real thought into the divorce. It's also wrong in both directions. The revival has Hank and Peggy still married and doing fine, so the divorce is off the table. And Judge's own comment settles the direction of travel. If the two shows were meant to connect, Hank was the son, not the future, which means Beavis and Butthead would have to be in the past, not the future. Then there's the theory that Beavis and Butthead grew up into Boomhauer and Dale. The pitch is mostly visual. Boomhauer looks a bit like an adult Beavis and has a rambling manner of speech that Beavis occasionally had. Dale has Butthead's coloring and something like his face. The theory suggests the two of them matured somewhat, dropped their childhood nicknames, took up football, and became the young men we see in Hank's flashbacks. There's an extended version where they are removed from their neglectful homes by social services and placed with families in Arlen. The objection is arithmetic, and it's fatal. Beavis and Butthead are 14 and in 9th grade during a period the show explicitly places in the 90s, with Bill Clinton turning up as the current president. Their dates of birth work out to 1978 and 1979. Boomhauer and Dale are grown men with houses at exactly the same time. I'll admit I find this one a bit lazy as theories go. It's built almost entirely on two characters having similar hair, and if that's the standard, then half of animation is related to the other half. There's a variant that swaps them round incidentally, with Hank as the grown-up Butthead and Dale as the grown-up Beavis, on the reasoning that Hank's exasperation is what Butthead would age into. I've seen that argued with real conviction. It has the same arithmetic problem, and it also requires you to believe that Butthead grew up into a man with strong opinions about lawn care, which I refuse to entertain on principle. Which brings me to the Daria one, which is my favorite thing in this entire section because of how much load it puts on one surname. The theory says Cotton had a second family in the town of Highland under the alias Morgendorfer, which would make Jake Morgendorfer another of Cotton's sons and Daria and Quinn Hank's nieces and Bobby's cousins. And the supporting argument is better than it has any right to be. Jake Morgendorfer was not the one sent to military school at all. He's the father in Daria, and this theory is mixing him up with a different unnamed son, which is a very precise description of how Cotton operated with his own children. There's also a line in the Daria episode where Jake has a heart attack, where his wife Helen mentions that Jake never thought she could do anything. And that particular flavor of contempt is extremely Cotton. None of it survives contact with a calendar, mind you. But of all the crossover theories, it's the one where somebody actually did the character work rather than just holding two drawings next to each other. There's a variant that swaps Cotton for Topsy, Cotton's own friend, as Beavis's grandfather. Same reasoning. A serviceman who got around, an illegitimate child, a couple of generations of chaos, and the family resemblance doing the heavy lifting. There's even a nod to the joke in Daria that there might be something in the drinking water in Highland. I do like that one, mostly because Topsy is such an obscure character to build a dynasty on. Somebody watched a background war veteran with about 4 lines and decided he'd fathered a bloodline. The cleanest objection to all of these, and it's the one that ends the discussion for me, is technological. Daria's world runs on late 90s equipment. So does King of the Hills, and it kept running for years afterwards on whatever the current year's equipment was. You cannot have a man in his 40s descended from a teenager who is using the same generation of computer as his wife. The timelines aren't separated by decades. They're happening at the same time. Which is a shame in a way because you can see why people want it. There's something appealing about the idea that all of Judge's suburbs are the same suburb viewed from different heights. And there's an argument that they are connected, just not by blood. They're connected by the fact that one man kept looking at the same kind of American town and finding different things in it, depending on where he stood. From the outside, it's Beavis and Butthead. From the inside, it's Arlen. There are 2 more entries in the crossover pile, and then I'll stop, because they represent the 2 extremes of what this kind of theorizing produces. The first is the ending people wanted. The proposal, back before the finale aired, was that the real last episode would have Hank and Peggy witness a murder, enter witness protection, and be relocated to a new town where they end up living next door to a pair of half-witted teenagers. There was a related version where Judge wraps the whole thing up in a film and Beavis and Butthead befriend Bobby. Neither happened, obviously. But I like that one because it's a fan theory that isn't really a theory at all. It's a wish. Somebody wanted these 2 shows in the same room and built a mechanism to get them there. And the mechanism is witness protection, which is very funny to me as a solution to a continuity problem. The second is the one that goes too far, and it's the theory that the entire series is a delusion experienced by Tom Anderson while he rots in a federal prison. There's an extension where Daria and Quinn are the government agents conducting the torture. The best response to that theory that I've ever seen was a single line from somebody underneath it, asking what it is with people and theories like this. Which is a fair question and worth sitting with for a second, because there is a genre of fan theory that isn't really about the show at all. It's about applying one move, the "it was all a dream" move, to whatever's in front of you. And you can do it to anything. You can do it to a nature documentary. It doesn't produce an insight, it just produces a mood, and the mood is always the same mood. The theories I've enjoyed most tonight are the opposite of that. They're the ones built on one specific detail somebody noticed and couldn't let go of. A mower, a tattoo, a dog with a narrow uterus. Those come from watching closely. The dream theories come from not needing to watch at all. I'll finish this section on a detail that isn't a theory at all, just a fact I've always enjoyed because it tells you what kind of show this is. Ladybird, Hank's bloodhound, is descended from a dog that tracked down James Earl Ray. That's established in the first season episode Westy Side Story. It's mentioned early, casually, in the same breath as everything else about the household, and then essentially never brought up again. A dog with a genuine connection to American history, lying on a suburban lawn in Arlen, Texas, watched over by a man who's increasingly worried about her health as she gets older. That's the kind of detail this show buried in the background constantly, and it's a decent part of why people have spent 30 years theorizing about it. If the writers hid that, what else did they hide? Anyway, quite a lot of these theories were sat there unresolved for 15 years, and then in 2025, the show came back and started answering some of them. Most shows that come back pretend no time has passed. Everyone's the same age, the kids are still kids, the furniture hasn't moved, and there's a general agreement not to mention it. King of the Hill didn't do that, and that decision was deliberate. The showrunner Saladin Patterson has said that Judge and Daniels wanted the characters in a new phase of life rather than frozen where they were, and that the prospect of aging them up was a large part of what made everyone excited to go back. So the setup is this. Hank and Peggy have spent years working a propane job in Saudi Arabia, building up a retirement fund, and they come home to an Arlen that's moved on without them. Bobby is 21, living in Dallas, working as a chef, and getting on with his 20s alongside Connie, Joseph, and Chain. 10 episodes, all of them released at once on the 4th of August, 2025. And a decent number of long-running theories got tidied up in the process. The Boomhauer question, first, since we were on it earlier. He is retired from the Rangers, which puts the fake badge theory to bed. He's got a girlfriend, and he's spending a lot of his time with her rather sheltered son, taking him to play in the alley, coaching his soccer team, introducing him to non-alcoholic beer. He picks up odd jobs through an app now and then. There's a stretch where he injures himself doing that, and Hank ends up taking on app work in his place, which produces a good deal of friction. He and Hank spend more of the season at odds than they ever did in 13 years of standing in the alley agreeing with each other. Then there's the Hank development that I still find funny days later. After years in Saudi Arabia, he's come around on soccer. Soccer. The man whose position on soccer was one of his defining stated beliefs, delivered as a monologue in front of witnesses. Turns out the fix was simply putting him somewhere the sport was ordinary and leaving him there for a decade. I don't think any fan theory predicted that, and I think it's the single best character decision in the revival because it doesn't undo who Hank is. It just proves the thing the show has always quietly argued about him, which is that he can be moved. It takes years and a change of continent, but he can be moved. Luann and Lucky have been retired from the show, with their absence often explained as them having moved away, and the fandom had actually proposed something very close to that as the respectful solution years earlier, given the circumstances. It's handled gently. Two things I want to mention properly rather than skip past. Johnny Hardwick, who voiced Dale from the beginning, died in 2023. He'd recorded 6 episodes before that, which makes the revival his last work, and Toby Huss took over from there. Jonathan Joss, who voiced John Redcorn, was murdered in June 2025, having recorded lines for 4 episodes. Both men are in the season. Neither of those characters exists without them, and I'd rather say so plainly than fold it into a list of trivia. Bobby, meanwhile, is doing better than any theory predicted. He's part owner and chef of a place called Robata Chain, described as traditional Japanese barbecue crossed with the German cooking traditions of the Texas Hill Country, which is a genuinely mad restaurant concept and also completely correct for that character. Bobby was always going to end up somewhere that required an explanation. And Peggy gets something too, which I was pleased about. She reconnects with writing and finds a sense of purpose that isn't teaching and isn't attached to Hank. Given how the back half of the original run treated her, that felt like a small correction being made. The finale of the season has Hank and Bobby sharing a home-brewed beer, and it's essentially the same note the original series went out on, which is two men who don't have the words finding an object they can both hold. In the first run, Hank spent 13 years struggling with Bobby being unusual. By the end of this one, he's openly acknowledging the boy's intelligence and his work ethic and his independence. The critical response landed on something I thought was well put, which is that among the enormous pile of comedy revivals we've had lately, this one stood out for how carefully it thought through what had changed about its characters and what deliberately hadn't. There were a couple of nice real-world touches around it too. Alamo Beer, which is the fictional lager the men have been drinking in that alley since 1997, got brewed for real by a San Antonio brewery in partnership with Hulu. Launched in Texas first, then wider. That's a fictional brand from a cartoon becoming an actual product you can buy, and it's very much in the spirit of a show that made propane salesmen feel represented. Now, what's still open? Dale and Nancy, obviously, still open, and I've said my piece on that. Buck Strickland, which is a theory family I haven't touched yet and probably should. There's a persistent idea that Buck is meaningfully worse than the show lets on. The strongest version concerns Debbie and points to how methodically Buck went about arranging for Hank to look responsible, and how close he came on more than one occasion to saying something he couldn't take back. There's a broader version that has him as an outright criminal figure, on the reasoning that he's improbably wealthy for a regional propane operation and has the exact set of vices you'd expect. I think that's mostly people overreading a man who is simply a coward and a drunk with a good salesman's instincts. But the Debbie episode is genuinely uncomfortable and always has been, and I don't think it's unreasonable that people keep going back to it. There's a much sweeter Buck theory that I do partly believe, which is that he really was the businessman Hank remembers. Not a delusion on Hank's part. Buck built the thing, and then Hank ran it for him for so long, and Miss Liz managed his social life for so long, that he degenerated into the man we meet. The theory holds that he only really shows flashes of the old version when one or the other of them isn't around, and there's enough scattered dialogue and flashback material across the series to support it. Then there's my favorite of the still unresolved ones, which is that Hank is secretly rich. The reasoning is that he's extremely good at keeping it quiet, and he's keeping it quiet on purpose, so that Bobby grows up understanding the value of money and doesn't get handed a fortune he hasn't learned how to hold. There is nothing supporting this, nothing whatsoever. Hank's finances are visibly the finances of an assistant manager at a propane branch, and half the plots in the show turn on him not being able to afford something. But it is such a Hank Hill idea. If he did have money, hiding it from his son for exactly that reason is precisely what he would do. The theory is wrong and completely in character at the same time, which is a rare achievement. There's a family of reboot theories from before the revival existed that are worth a mention now that we can mark them. People proposed an adult Bobby raising children of his own and using Hank's advice in a modernized setting, which didn't happen and would have aged him too far. People proposed a show following Gracie and GH as the new teenagers, which also didn't happen. And somebody suggested an entire episode told from Boomhauer's perspective, where everyone else talks like him and he sounds normal, which the show has technically already done once and could absolutely do again. That last one is the only pre-revival prediction I'd still like to see cashed in. And the last one, which people keep proposing and which the show has never quite gone for, Hank taking over Strickland Propane. Buck retiring and Hank finally getting the thing his entire working life has been pointed at when he buys a 51% stake in Strickland Propane. Part of me wants it. Most of me thinks it would be a mistake because Hank has never actually wanted to own it. He's wanted to do it properly. Those are different appetites, and the show has always known the difference. I do think all these theories are circling the same thing in the end. Nobody builds 30 years of elaborate speculation around a show that gave them everything. They build it around a show that kept implying there was more underneath and then declined to dig. A dog with a footnote in history. A man who's known your wife longer than you have and never mentioned it. A father whose entire biography rests on his own word. Arlen was constructed with an enormous amount of care, and then presented as though nothing much was going on, and people have spent 3 decades refusing to accept that, which is probably the highest compliment you can pay a cartoon about propane. And I think there's something else in it, which is that this show has always rewarded rewatching in a way most comedies don't. Comedies usually run out. You know the jokes, the timing stops surprising you, and the thing goes flat. King of the Hill doesn't do that because most of what's good in it isn't the joke. It's the way Hank stands. It's Bill's face when nobody laughs. It's the fact that Peggy keeps a scrapbook of her own achievements and nobody in that house has ever asked her about it. Theories are what happens when a show is dense enough to survive a 4th viewing. You stop watching for the plot and start noticing furniture, and then you start wondering about the furniture. And there's more of it coming. Season 15 is already scheduled as part of a 2-season order, so some of tonight's open questions will presumably get answered and a fresh crop will replace them. I'd guess by this time next year there'll be a whole new set of arguments about things that happen in Dallas rather than Arlen. I've got a couple of things in mind for future videos if you fancy them. The Dale and Nancy material alone would fill an hour without any trouble, and I'd quite like to do a proper history of Arlen itself at some point. The geography and the businesses and the running background jokes nobody notices until their 4th watch. There's a surprising amount in there, but that's for another night. That's most of them anyway. That's what people have been arguing about since 1997, laid out end to end, and I hope some of it was new to you. Sleep